In this lecture, you're going to learn how to secure database and make credentials to be more flexible. And the way to do that is to actually pull the information that we're displaying here from a configuration file. There are several ways to actually implement this in PHP. You can use a third-party library like .env file, or we can just create a simple configuration file and use it in our project. So we're going to be creating a configuration file. I'll right click in the root directory. I'm going to create a new folder called this config. Right, so inside of the config folder, I'm going to create a new PHP file and I'm going to call this app. So right now inside of app, we are just going to return an array, and this array is going to contain all our configuration information. For this lecture, we are going to focus on two aspects. We will focus on database. So we're going to have configurations for our database that is also going to be equal to another array. And then we are also going to have configurations for mail's client credentials that is also going to be equal to another array. All right, so if we look at database.php again, the information that we need to establish a connection is the DSN, which includes the driver, the host, the database name, and then the username and the password. All right, so we are going to create all of this inside of our config. So first thing first, inside of our database array, we are going to have a key for drivers. This should be equal to MySQL. And then we are going to have another key for the host. So it's going to be equal to localhost. And then we will have another key. This will be the database name. So it will be db name should be equal to register in our case. And then we have one more key. Sorry, it's going to be two more keys, username and the password. Right, so this will be equal to the database username. In my case, this is root. And then the last one for the database that we want to add will be password. And right now, this is empty string. Next, for mail, let's look at the data that we'll be needing for mail. First one will be the transport. The other one will be the encryption type, port, host name, username, password, from, and the sender. All right, so let's go ahead and just update this now. App.php. First one that we want to add here will be the transport, which is essentially the protocol for sending. This will be SMTP. And then the next one will be encryption type. This will be SSL or TLS. In our case, we're using TLS. And then the next one will be the port. This is 587. And then the next one will be host. Should be the server that you're using. If you're online, you should use the appropriate one. But on localhost, use Gmail. So it should be smtp.gmail.com. Next will be username. So this will be your Gmail username, or if you're online, it will be your cPanel username. And then next will be the password. Right, the same thing. If you're using Gmail, it will be your Gmail password. If you are running this on a live server, then this will be your cPanel password. And then next, we're going to be having from. Then in our case, this is just going to be no reply from devscreencast.com. And then we are going to have the last one here, which is going to be the sender underscore name be equal to user authentication. All right, so now we have our configuration set up. This app.php file just returns an array, which means wherever we are going to be requiring this file, it's just going to return an array to us. All right, so let's see how to now implement this inside of database.php. So we are going to first of all start by requiring that file. We are going to save it into a variable called config. Remember, app.php is going to return an array. So we can therefore just require it and save it into a variable called config. Okay, so we say underscore directory. And then we want to go one level up and then get into the config folder and then look for app. So right now inside of this config will be an array. Let's do a var dump and then just exit. Okay, so let's try to view this on the browser. So be alt.dev. Right, so you see that we have the array here for the database, and then we also have for the mail. It means that we can now begin to use this inside of our script. All right, so let's go back to the text editor, then get rid of this. So what I am going to do here is create a variable driver should be equal to config. Inside of config, the key that we want to look for is database, and then the element that we want to target will be driver. Okay, so that's for the driver part. The next thing that we will need will be host. So we're going to say host should be equal to config database. Then the element that we want to target will be host. We're just going to repeat the same thing for the username, database name, and also the password. Okay, so this will be DB name. And then we set the variable to be equal to DB name. So be username, set the variable to be DB underscore username. This will be password. And then we set the variable to be DB underscore password. Okay, so what we have done now is actually extract our database credentials out into these variables, which we are going to be passing to the PDO instance. So next step for us now will be to construct our DSN. We can get rid of all of this. And right here, we can then configure our DSN. Right, so we have our driver, column, then host should be equal to our variable host, semicolon, then a space, DB name should be equal to the variable DB name. Right, so we have our DSN set up. The next thing, we need to change the username variable here to be DB username, and then password to be database password. Right, since I actually cut the driver out of here, so I'm going to paste it back here. Okay, so now we have everything set up. If everything works correctly, we should still be able to make a connection to the database. So let's go over again and try to log in. Right, so click on login, then put a username, should be demo or demos. Let's just try. Charlie cannot remember the password. Okay. All right, so you have entered an invalid password. It means that we can actually make a connection to the database. Let's try. Okay, seems I cannot remember the password. All right, so welcome back. You're being logged in. Means that everything still works fine for our database. The next step now will be to update the configuration for email. So let's go over to the code and then go to send-email.php. So at the very top, we are also going to require that file and store it in a variable called config. Should be equal to require. Go one level up, then descend into the config folder, and then look for app.php. Store the value inside of this variable config. Then we can now begin to replace all of this. Right, so take config and come here. This should be config transport. Right, so we can always refer to this. We have transport, which is SMTP encryption, port, host, and so on. Right, so the next one will be config encryption, and then the next one will be config port, and then the next one will be config host. All right, so we're making one mistake here. Config, the key is mail. Okay, and then inside of mail, we are looking for transport key. Okay, so don't forget to include this. Otherwise, you're going to get an error. So this is config mail. Okay, so here we're going to say config. It should be mail, and then username. So the next one will be config mail password. As long as we ensure that all these keys match what we have in app.php, there will be no issues. We have username, we have password, from, and sender. Right, so let's go back. Should be for sender, config, mail, sender, and then here config, mail, from. So now that we have all of this set up here, we are now going to test and see if we can still send mail from our application. All right, so we go over to the browser. So we're going to attempt to either create a new account or just do password recovery. So let's recover password. Undefined index password. Okay, so you see that I already spelled something wrong here. So when it's attempting to read from the configuration file, it says this index is not defined. So instead of password, I just spelled PAS. So we're going to correct that now. Should be config password. Okay, so let's do a refresh and then send mail to this email address. Right, so password recovery, reset link has been sent. Let's try to open that email. Should be Gmail. All right, so password recovery, this is the one we just sent just now. This is 0 minutes ago. And then we have our token here. So everything still works correctly. So the beauty of what we have done now is that we have successfully extracted our credentials to a single file. So if you're using version control like Git, when you are doing check-in, you are not going to check in this file. So this app.php will be, you create an example copy of this. Let's say you just right click and refactor, make a copy, app_example. Okay, so when you check in this application to your version control, you're going to check in the example file, which will actually not contain any of your information. Like all this will be SSS, database SSS. So when you send this to someone else, all they need to do is just rename this to app.php and then put in their own credential. So you successfully extract your credential out from version control. Or if you're going to share your code with someone else, so what they need to do is just rename this to app.php, put their credential, and then they'll be able to use the system.